my name is Geeta Gupta. I'm a pediatric pulmonologist and sleep physician, and I'd just like to say, it's an incredible privilege to be here. I've learned so much from each of you, so thanks for inviting me to speak and spend time with your community. All right, so we're going to fly through the first few slides because some of you might have seen the preview of this information at previous meetings, and I'm just sharing some of the updates as well, and then we'll share some new information as well. All right, so we know that disordered sleep can lead to feeling very sleepy or hypersomnolent during the day, insomnia, difficulty falling asleep and staying asleep, just fatigue. You're not sleepy, but you have this body heaviness that's just really difficult to deal with throughout the day. Many children, especially with conditions like LGS, they're having their own private parties in the middle of the night, and they're the ones in charge till 3 a.m. and then they decide to finally fall asleep. That's impacts their sleep, but also the sleep of siblings and family members. And then, there can be very serious consequences of sleep disorders, such as sleep apnea. You can have impacts on memory, brain development, blood pressure, pressures which are within the lung, metabolism, and then, consequences as severe as sudden unexpected death and epilepsy as well. And then, there's also the impact on the caregiver. Many caregivers are staying up at night, watching for seizures, watching their child sleep, making sure their child is breathing at night, and perhaps even having disrupted sleep themselves if they're co-sleeping. We've already talked about the survey that Jazz Pharmaceuticals and the Lennox-Gastaut Syndrome Foundation basically surveyed many of you, over 500 of you, and almost 90% of respondents cited poor sleep for their loved ones, and then 90% of respondents cited poor caregiver sleep. This is a major problem for all of you, and that is why you very graciously funded a research project that I did, where this is going to be the bulk of the talk, where I share the results now. So we talked about how the meeting of the minds, we discuss what might be helpful things to study in children and adults with Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, and I'm going to share some of those results with you today. So the first aim of the study was to determine which combination of sleep questionnaires, data collected from wearable devices, home sleep apnea tests, which are basically sleep studies that you do at home, are most feasible for assessing sleep in people with Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. Then I wanted to see how long can we do this in the home environment. So people who participated in the study, they were invited to participate for up to 4 weeks. They could drop out at any time. We wanted to see how long people actually would want to stay in a study like this, and they were allowed to do all of these modalities that I've listed here. So in-lab sleep study, Holmes test, different questionnaires, wearing a wearable device, and then filling out sleep and seizure logs. The average age of the children was about 12 years of age, almost half for boys and girls. And 6 people remained in the study at the end of 4 weeks. We had a total of 32 people. And so interestingly, everyone who agreed to do a one-time only activity, such as a home sleep test or a sleep study, they all did it. One person who agreed to do a home sleep test, unfortunately, he passed away before he could actually do the home sleep test, so hence 15 out of 16 did that. We see that people who agreed to do serial surveys, really there was a dropout as the time progressed. Most people wore a wearable device, which was the Apple Watch, for pretty much the whole study, but sleep diaries and seizure logs were much more difficult to fill out. So it may be feasible to conduct longitudinal studies of sleep in people with Lennox-Gastaut syndrome for up to 2 weeks, and there are highest rates of completion in things that are the most convenient. So then our next hypothesis was how we wanted to understand, how common is sleep apnea in people with or children in particular, with Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. We had, as you saw, sleep studies and questionnaires. And so these are the questionnaires that we used. We used home sleep tests. We used the WatchPat device, which I talked about during the workshop yesterday, and then a formal in-lab sleep study. The pediatric sleep questionnaire looks at the sleep-related breathing disorder subdomain in particular, looks at sleep apnea, and then there's a children's sleep habits questionnaire, which examines a variety of sleep problems. We saw that most children had positive questionnaires in sleep studies, and that the questionnaires and sleep study results did not always match. I also forgot to mention, and I wanted to mention this, I have a lot of pictures here that explain the results. Feel free to look at them if you like graphs and pictures, and if you just like to hear about the results and conclusions, feel free to ignore the graphs too. They're just extra. Most of the children's sleep habit questionnaire scores were normal, and people, not surprisingly, like the home sleep test better, and they found that things that you could do at home were most convenient. The home sleep apnea tests were, in 2 out of the 3 people who completed both an in-lab and home sleep apnea test, the results were pretty similar. So we conclude that obstructive sleep apnea is frequent in children with Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. Sleep questionnaires may not always accurately capture if you have sleep apnea or not, so it's important to do a sleep study if you suspect obstructive sleep apnea. Children with LGS have a wide range of sleep concerns. Wearable devices can be useful and may supplement in-lab sleep studies. And it's possible that home sleep apnea tests may be a good alternative to sleep studies, so we have to learn more about that. We also wanted to see if sleep diaries would be helpful in revealing a pattern of daytime and nighttime sleep. As you saw in one of the previous slides, we had a pretty low rate of completion of the sleep diaries, and we found of the people who did do sleep diaries, here are some examples. Some people had a lot of consolidated sleep. Some kids had sleep both during the day and night. A lot of the times parents weren't sure if their child was asleep or not. So sleep diaries are helpful, but really ideally supplemented with a wearable device. We wanted to see what the pattern of sleep would be day to day within each child. So does your kid sleep the same way every day? And then between children with LGS, do kids with LGS in general have a particular type of sleep pattern? And so one of our colleagues, Dr. Walsh, helped us with these analyses. This is really exciting. This is a representative example from one kid who wore an Apple Watch for over 4 weeks. You can see that many of the children were able to consistently wear an Apple Watch for over 4 weeks. You can also see where there's a lot of blue, like dark blue, that's a lot of movement. So some nights there was a lot of movement, some nights, the sleep was very restful. So it was pretty variable in terms of both sleep duration. So you can see where there's lines, that's estimated sleep, but also probably sleep quality. Dr. Walsh used 2 different sleep models and basically found that on average, children slept for about 6 hours per night and had a lower than average REM sleep at 12.9%. Another thing that we measure is melatonin to understand our circadian rhythms. So that's basically our body clock of what are our patterns of sleep and wakefulness. So she also found that there was a wide distribution of melatonin, and usually the melatonin peaked at around 9:30 a.m., and she was able to estimate this using movement data from the Apple Watch. And that's kind of a later time compared to most people. So that suggests that most children with LGS had a later sleep time. And then, that was pretty variable within each individual, which matches up with the experience that I've heard from you all, that the sleep schedule is not very consistent from day to day. She was able to use the Apple Watch data to determine that oftentimes sleep is not always consolidated. So the dark black that you see is just really consolidated restful sleep, where you see the yellow and gray and black, that's very patchy, that's very fragmented. So the wearables were able to detect that. We also found that children with LGS have a lower sleep regularity index compared to pediatric norms. So what the sleep regularity index is it what, as the name suggests, it's a measure of how regular someone's sleep is. So that's when they fall asleep, when they wake up, and then that pattern of sleep consistently. So children with LGS had less regular sleep than what you would expect for similarly aged children. So we talked about how, the children who participate in our study, they were troopers, they wore the watch, they did everything, and they did it for a long time. And so to conclude, wrist-worn sleep tracking is feasible in children with Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. Longitudinal data capture reveals less stable rhythms and altered sleep architecture, meaning less REM sleep or dream deep sleep than you would expect in a similarly aged child. And then also what's really exciting about this is that, the Apple Watch and similar devices, they are cheaper than the research grade devices. They're more accessible. That means we can do more with it, and we can, it really just opens the door for the types of research we can do studying sleep in children with Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. And then lastly, this wasn't really part of the grant, but I thought this was important information to share with you. We also looked at the association between poor quality sleep and quality of life in not only children with Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, but their caregivers and siblings as well. So it's interesting for the quality of life questionnaire. So we looked at the quality of life in childhood, epilepsy 55 questionnaire, and family impact questionnaire. If the score is higher, that's a good thing. That means your quality of life is better. For the sleep questionnaires, though, if the score is higher, that means your sleep is worse. So if you see a negative number, that means there's a association between bad sleep and bad quality of life. And so, these questionnaires, they measure a variety of domains, as you can see here, QoLSI 55, family impact, which is a really neat, very few studies have looked at this, caregiver emotional well-being, family functioning, practical burden. And you can see that, there was a wide distribution of scores for both of these questionnaires, really reflecting your families, right? Every family is different. Everybody's quality of life is impacted in a different way. We also saw a very mixed result. So the red is negative, meaning bad sleep leads to bad quality of life. For the most part, that's what we saw. But we did see some interesting findings too. For example, increased bedtime resistance was related to improved finances. But then if you looked at the questions, the finance questions were about, my child has more access to resources like PT, OT, speech, but then some questions were more about activities. So I think we really have to tease apart these questions a bit better to really make sense of, relationships that don't make sense. Obviously, if people aren't sleeping well in the home, it's going to impact their job and economics. Similarly, for the sleep apnea questionnaire, we found that if you had a higher risk of sleep apnea, there were significantly bad impacts on social functioning in children with epilepsy. So to conclude, generally worse sleep is associated with worse quality of life for both the children with LGS and their family members. And these relationships are complex and need to be investigated further. Here's another mentee poll. I hope this one works. And if it doesn't, I have a backup. I can tell you what the results are. But if you don't mind scanning this QR code, I'd love to know, where do we go from here? I have some examples of ideas, but there's so many things that I think we need to study. I'm not going to read this list out loud to you, but there are so many things, like larger scales of sleep apnea, for example, focus on caregiver, device validation, behavioral interventions, and so on. So let me know what your thoughts are, and I will tell you what the dominant thoughts are here. So caregiver sleep, that seems to be the biggest here. Other ideas are, when are sleep studies required, effects of medications, device validation. So it seems like the three most common questions are about medications, caregiver sleep, and device validation. So that is very helpful information for me, and I will definitely consider that when we use these pilot data and move forward with the next steps. Thank you so much.